So, some of you may be joining for the first time. And if that's the case, my name's Tony Dubiel. I'm out of Raleigh, North Carolina, and I work for Red Hat. And I'm a product solutions architect, or what we call a specialist architect, focused on Ansible. And my primary skill set and subject matter expertise is network automation. So most of what I talk about is something to do with network automation. So today, what we're going to talk about on the meetup is ACI as code using Ansible, and we're going to go through a little bit of a level set, right? So I'm going to not go into like, hey, here's how you know, plan to deploy ACI in its entirety. But what I would like to do is just spend a few minutes with a backdrop of just in general automation and some of the constructs that we really need to understand in terms of automating ACI. So some of you may already know most of what I'm going to talk about. This is mostly for those who may be new or just getting started with automating Cisco ACI. So we'll just touch on some of those key salient points that we really need to understand to help us better understand how we can benefit from using the Ansible collection of modules for ACI and be able to map to the structured data and the objects as they're defined in ACI. So it's just a bit of learning to help us understand that, and it translates to Ansible or really any other tool, but it's just really just like a point of the framework from which ACI uses a model for their objects that we really need to understand to get started. So after we understand that, and it won't take too long, we'll just go through a few slides. We're going to go through two different demos. So the first demo is for those who have possibly started ACI, their journey with ACI fabrics from a manual configuration, and in doing so and following best practices around naming conventions and organizing different constructs and how you would typically build an ACI fabric, mapping those constructs to like day zero types of tasks, day one and day two. A lot of times there's significant work that goes into that, and it's really good data points to be able to use as you start to transform what you've done into automation. So as part of that, again, maybe not ubiquitous for everybody on the call, but a lot of you have probably used the REST API of ACI if you've started that journey of automation, and perhaps you've used Postman, and more specifically like Postman runners. And in doing so, there's again an opportunity to take like spreadsheets, CSV files, repurpose them, repackage them to some extent, and use them for those types of tools. And you can certainly use them as a source of truth for configurations moving into this paradigm of using Ansible to automate ACI. So, it's a great way to take what you've done and then, start to deploy ACI fabrics using Ansible. And then moving forward, beyond that, like there's certain limitations to what you can do with CSV files, primarily around as you're operationalizing your ACI and building, a lot of configurations or more complex configurations in your fabrics, there's a lot of configuration, where you could potentially have conflicts, overlapping ports that you're trying to use, just trying to reconcile those situations where you really have to have a lot more visibility into the operational state of your ACI fabric. So that's where we can take advantage of just in general Ansible's ability to provide you with human readable structured data in the form of YAML, so you don't have to wrap your head around XML or JSON files in their entirety, right? So a lot of times if you've looked into ACI, especially around the fabric configurations for the snapshots, or if you want to import or export out, there's a lot of data, structured data. So it's nice if we can start to take that data and make it more modular. And as we glean, the operational and configuration state of the fabric, being able to work with that in a more modular way, so we don't have to wrap our head around that entire data structure of the fabric. Because really you have two choices. It's either, you're dealing with the entire fabric or you're dealing with the tenant constructs. So there's, a lot more to ACI than really just even like the tenant as well. So we'll unpack that a bit in the slides as well. But when we get into the demo, what you're going to see is we can attack this from the perspective of like like an unknown, right? So if you've spent any time in Cisco DevNet with their always on ACI fabric, the simulator, you'll realize that at any point in time, those configurations can be totally different. And a lot of times there's, in terms of the amount of configurations, and depending on what time of day that you actually access that fabric, there could be tons and tons of configurations that are changing all the time. So if you really want it to, build in an environment like that where, it's not very static, in the sense that you never know the state of the configurations or the state of any of your pools of resources. You really want to understand, that existing fabric and be able to pull that data in and be able to modify it, but also having done that, being able to add new configurations with, a sense of certainty that there's no conflicts, right? So you're not using, ports that have already been used or VLANs that have already been used, or, in terms of naming, one of the benefits of ACI is that you can have overlapping IP addressing and names as long as it's unique as part of a distinguished name. So that distinguished name construct, that may be something you're not familiar with. So we're going to cover that here in a second. But just know that like some of these configurations, to some extent in the fabric, because it's virtualized, right? You can reuse things, but you just can't reuse them kind of at, think of it as at the same level. For example, like in a tenant, if I have an application profile and whatever that relative name is that, what I name that particular, parameter, then I can't do that again in that same tenant, but I could have another tenant, right? And then I can, actually reuse names or reuse IP addresses. But there has to be that separation in what they call a distinguished name. So it's really just a path, and everything that we're configuring, we're learning how to navigate to this specific path so that way we have access to that object. And in ACI, everything is an object, right? So there's nothing that you configure from the GUI that you can't configure using the API, or in this case, using the collection of modules for ACI, from an Ansible perspective. Now, on the configuration side, there is really good, feature parity with what you can configure and what can be done in Ansible. On the operational side of things, then you can glean a lot of information, and you'll see that in these demos. But sometimes there are certain, objects that you're pointing to that you want to request information from. So, like as an example, if you're pointing to a particular class, and again, we'll talk more about the classes here in a second. But if I wanted to list out, like let's say, the class in ACI for tenants, then I want to list out like all of the tenants, at that particular level. I can do that with the REST API call, but I can further refine that using query parameters. So in order for me to use those types of ways of optimizing, like how I'm pulling data back from the fabric for operational state, then I can do that with these particular filters and things, and using the ACI REST module. So it's sort of a workaround, but it's more for like those operational things like faults and health scores and those types of like troubleshooting objects that are very important, in that regard. But for configuring, it's very easy. We can create our own roles and use these modules, and it just build things in the order, representing how we would, normally do this manually, and then just script this out into a playbook, or more importantly, into like a workflow, and start to manage, these steps and what we want to do for pre and post checks, to validate that our configurations are good. So we'll be able to do all these things. We just have to understand, a couple of these high level concepts. So one of the things that's important and very valuable in ACI is that everything is an object. And I think I already said that, but everything, so the operational states and the configuration states are an object, and they're organized in what they call this management information tree. So in this example here, you can see that at the top level, we have the policy universe. And you should be seeing my mouse move around, but I could also, just in case, let me Let me check out this laser pointer, right? So you should be able to see that. So at the top, we have the policy universe. It's kind of like the root um, of everything in this tree. And then we have these levels just beneath the policy universe. And these are like the main categories. Like when you go to the GUI, and we'll do that here shortly, you'll see these, not in this particular same exact order, but they're represented in the GUI, right? So we have the whole, tab for tenants, our fabric access policies, and we will manipulate some of these configurations. These are more like your day zero types of configs where you're establishing these policies for how you can connect physical devices to the fabric, and also your virtual port channels and those types of things, in terms of connecting like to VMware or to OpenShift. That is also, from a programmability standpoint, managed through these VM domains or VMMs, because it's not just virtual machines, it's also the container solutions too. So OpenShift and Kubernetes, but then you also have, the hypervisors in there as well. Layer 4 through 7 services, a lot of that is around service graphing. In the early days of ACI, there used to be more specific automation around third-party vendors. And when we mention layer 4 through 7 services, we're talking about load balancers and firewalls, right? So these devices that are a part of the tenant space that typically control either east or west traffic or north and southbound, like in and out of the fabric, or between your EPGs across bridge domains, right? And moreover, you may be connecting fabrics together in multi-pod or multi-site, which introduces additional APIs, like if you're using the Nexus dashboard orchestrator. But there's a lot of touch points, right, and interdependencies in how you would manually configure these things. And there's a big benefit of automating a lot of these because there are so many touch points, and because there's third-party things outside of ACI, you can go a step further with your Ansible and have the ability of automating your firewall of choice and load balancers, and take advantage of those collections. And because Ansible has such a wide variety of collections of modules in our ecosystem, more than likely you're covered there, in terms of being able to hit the ground running with Ansible and address automation from all those different layers of not just the infrastructure, but even into the applications, the workloads that you're running on top of the ACI. So having said that, these are kind of high level. And then if we look at the tenant and do a double click there, that's where we start to get into those paths that I mentioned and that whole notion of distinguished and relative names. So the relative name would be like if we had named a tenant, right? The relative name would be whatever that name of that tenant is. So let's say it's called lab, right? So at the tenant level, we have a tenant that's named lab and a tenant that's named production, or whatever we want to name our tenants, and they're all separate. And as we double click into each tenant, right, then that's where we start to move down into these children objects. So the tenant is the parent object. It's also a high level object in what they call the policy universe. So the tenant, whatever that name is always a part of the distinguished name. And we'll see that on the next slide, that it's, again, we're creating a path. So as we create an application profile under like the tenant lab, we give it a name. Underneath the application profile, there's going to be EPG, so an endpoint group. And then where it becomes a bit confusing is like we have that linear path of, okay, here's a parent tenant and the child is application profile, but then it has a child called endpoint group. There's also these many to many relationships where, okay, an endpoint group also has a dependency on a bridge domain. So a bridge domain is a child construct under tenant, and an application profile is a child construct under tenant, but our endpoint group has a dependency in its configuration back to a bridge domain. So you can't really do anything with the endpoint group until you establish a bridge domain configuration, because without a bridge domain, you really have no network connectivity, right? So for it to work, there's those interdependencies. So another one is like a contract. So a contract That could be considered like optional depending on how your ACI is set up. So there's that whole notion of network centric where you kind of allow everything between your EPGs in terms of traffic flow. And the VRF is like from a networking perspective, that's more around like the IP address for like the layer 3 component of it. In the bridge domain, you can kind of think of that as a VLAN, but it's not really a VLAN because underneath this, everything's virtualized as VXLAN. So that's more ACI, networkism. So we're not going to get too much into that, but they all serve their own purpose. Like to provide a network, you have to have all these piece parts. But a contract, you may or may not implement them depending on if you're going to, provide that whitelist model or blacklist, because the default's whitelist. So it's a zero trust deployment of the way that you would segment this ACI environment. But when that is, as soon as you start to enable these contracts. So when you do that, you have to decide if you're going to allow everything, or the default is only allow the traffic, in a whitelist model that you want through. So you have to account for all these things. So that opens up more dependencies. So in the demo, I'm going to do like all these same things. We're not going to build like everything in an ACI fabric, but we're going to give you a pretty good sampling, right? So it's just, not exhaustive. It's just, a really good representation of most of what you would build from like, a generic kind of day zero with your fabric policies, and then going into the tenant constructs and building like a layer 3 out and contracts. We'll go through those things. But certainly there's a lot of other capabilities that you can, configure within the fabric. But as you start to use these modules, then it's all the same. You can use these same modules the same way. And there's a lot of patterns that you'll start to learn and see how easy it is to use these collection of modules, right? So whatever you're doing in your manual process, you can replicate that using these modules with automation. And you really don't even have to think about these paths and things so much, because ACI kind of does that for us. We just have to know how to read that information, and then we can take advantage of that to populate our configuration files to define our variables. So having said that, this is kind of like the double click of what we're going to actually need to understand within the configurations. So in the GUI, we have common names. So this is how we see it represented to us as we use the ACI GUI, right? And the ACI GUI is a great example of ClickOps, because most of these common names and navigating through them is a lot of work, right? A lot of clicks and drill downs, within drop-down menus and fields and such to populate this stuff. It really is a wonderful candidate for automation in order to save yourself, from what we call a death by 1,000 clicks, right? Because it's just a lot of work, So what you can do with automation, once you understand this, is really you're just, translating, from these common names, the things that you're familiar with in the GUI, and then adding a prefix to them. This is what it looks like represented as you're defining these parameters, what they look like from ACI's point of view. And it's pretty straightforward. So if you look at them like a tenant, right? So it's always prefixed with a TN and a dash, right? So each prefix, has that dash, and then it's the parameter. So in a tenant, there's really only two parameters, like at the parent level of a tenant. It's the name and a description, right? So the required parameter is the name. You don't have to provide a description, that's optional, but without a name, then you wouldn't have a tenant. So you have this required parameter, right? So this prefix property is TN for anything that's tenant, and those point to a class. So you can think of the class as being the software, right, that renders the tenant, and how that's organized, because ACI is object-oriented, programming and how it's put together. So you have all these modules and classes. So those are combined together. So in terms of the modules, the one that we deal with the most is the fabric virtualization. So that's all prefixed with the FV. So when you look at the actual tenant name, it's FV tenant with a capital T. And CTX is context, but that's for VRS, because context is just another way of saying VRF. And pretty much all of these abbreviations map pretty easily to their common name for the class name. And some of them are the same, like subnet is actually subnet, so that's easy. The one that's a little bit funky that a lot of people wonder what it means is like when you get down to contract, it's BRCP, And I'm pretty sure that that is binary contract policy, right? So that one, if you Google that, that's a hard one to find. It usually takes me a couple tries, but most of them are a little bit more intuitive in what they're doing. So you have a notion of, this class name, and then here it represents the parent class. So the only thing that is higher than a tenant is the uni, right? Because that was at the very top of that management information tree. And the uni, when you create that path, that distinguished name, then sometimes you're not going into a tenant. Sometimes you're going into infra, right? Because there's a lot of infrastructure types of configurations, mainly when you're building like the fabric from day zero, right? So you have a lot of underlay types of configs and those types of things. So sometimes you're not in the tenant. Or you're in the VMM, like we showed with virtual machine, or container integrations. So sometimes the parent class is one of those, but their parent is always uni at the top, right? And then when we go into tenant, we have like these child classes like the VRF, bridge domain, just like we showed on the previous slide. Excuse me for a second. One of the my phone just went off because of the flash flood thing. Shut that off. Sorry about that. Right. So we have tenant as the parent, and then sometimes we go, a couple layers into that. So like if we look at like this IP class, right, then that is under an endpoint, right? So a client endpoint. So they just all map to that. There's documentation links. I have a link to these objects where you can kind of figure out, okay, here's the main parents and children and that type of thing. That's one way of doing this. There's also other tools that we're going to talk about that make it easy to figure out what these all are. So just going like to the next step is what's important here is, from understanding like how we, define the names, for those properties or those parameters that we're defining from the GUI, right? So these are just the regular object names to the left. When we start to build those configurations, like for the tenant, it's always TN, and heroes would be that name parameter. So heroes is just a name of a tenant. And then this is what its example distinguished name would look like. So it always has the uni. All of them start with uni because that's at the top. And then when we're talking about anything that's, a configuration that has anything to do with tenants, it's always going to start with the tenant because that's the parent. So tn.heroes. And then as we work our way down, to a child construct like a VRF in a tenant, you can see we just build our way to the right. So we have the tenant heroes and then CTX development. So development is just the name parameter, right, for that VRF. And when we define those name parameters, those are called relative names. Because what we could do is we could, reuse them as long as it's in a different tenant. So that's where the distinguished name is the unique path. And then the relative name is where it lives, where that parameter, that object lives within that path. And it has to be unique, at that level, but it could exist somewhere else. So mainly that's around like mostly IP addresses and VLANs and those types of things is where we may want to have, the ability to overlap some of those. And we're just using them because it's virtualized in ACI. We're able to do that. And it doesn't, provide us with any conflicts that we have to deal with. So these are just examples. Same thing, just distinguished names, more specific. So how do we, understand without going through a lot of documentation, how can we build out these distinguished names? So one way is we can read in these configurations like we're going to do in the demo, and it's already packaged together for us. So then we can use that to modify or as a model to create new configurations. But if we want to understand these like outside of that, there's other tools that we can use that help us figure that out as well, to figure out these distinguished names, these paths. And then here's the classes over here, like we were looking at before. The FV is the fabric virtualization, so FV tenant, and then all of those tenant types of constructs have FV. Pretty much everything on this example is an FV, but there's also VZs. So like I mentioned network centric. So that one, when you have it open up, that is a VZ any, and the VZ would be virtual zone. So it's more around like your security stuff, your segmentation, so contracts and those types of things would have those classes, right? So just note that the classes are a little bit different, depending on what we're talking about. And the last thing here is learning how to directly point to an object. for operational purposes. So if we want to request data, these query filters are important. We don't really have time to get into these. I just provided like a very simple example, which is this query target. And you'll see this in my demonstration where I want to check the health score of a particular tenant that we're building to make sure that none of those children configurations or anything in the tenant has degraded the health score. Because sometimes if you have configuration issues that don't align with what's in the fabric, you'll see your health score drop. And then you can use that as a way of drilling down into your config and then figuring out what you need to change, so that you have a healthier configuration for your tenant. Sometimes the health score also takes a hit because you may have faults. So that could be, just, physical things about the fabric or just, errors that it's seeing. So there's different faults that impact your health score. So you can query those APIs. There's just not like a specific module for those, or there really isn't for many of those. So a lot of times that's where we're using the REST API module for Ansible, or API calls directly to the APIC. And then we have to provide the path. So in the path, you can see that we have the API. So they all start the same way. API node, the MO means manage object. And then we start, with that tree. So it's uni. And in this case, we're looking at a tenant. And then you can see that there's further parsing. So I have the FV tenant. And then underneath tenant, I have attributes. And then I have the name. So I'm able to parse through some data like in my existing configuration to get to the name of that tenant. And then the last part of this is health. So this is, an API that's for the health scores. So we want to see a health score for that specific tenant name. And then we have a query parameter that says query target self. And if you look at the query target here, you have 3 different options. You have self, children, and subtree. So self would just show me the health score for that very specific tenant. And I've called it out, to the tenant name. If I wanted to see the children configuration underneath that particular tenant, then I would define it as children, and we would see like EPGs and bridge domains and VRFs. We would see, any related health score to those types of things. If it's available, it will drill down at that level. If we want to just see all of it, just, let's go through and see everything that's a health score, that is related, to a tenant, then we could select subtree, and it would give us like the verbose, response of everything that's underneath. So health is probably not the best example because there's not like a health score specifically for like everything that you configure under the tenant. It's more at like the tenant level. But any of those, REST API calls where we're doing a get to see something, at a particular level, then we have those query filters so that way we can see like the specific config or the children configurations, or like everything from the parent down to the children, like everything would come back. But then obviously you would have more data coming back. So the filters kind of help you limit that data response, that payload that comes back. So query filters are important, especially if you're, requesting like a lot of data from, the standpoint of like an operational check, and you want it to happen quicker. So performance-wise, you just want that data that you need, and not, it's just like pulling in like the entire fabric config as opposed to what we're doing, more modular. You could think of it along those lines. So here are some of the tools that you can use. We're not going to actually go through these due to time, but this is an object reference. So if you go to this link, you can figure out those naming conventions for those relative names, the prefix for the those properties, and also the class names and what those prefixes were. You can use this as a reference to figure those out. If you're not so much into documentation for finding out these things, what I would recommend is, my favorite tool is the Visori, the object browser. And what this is kind of like it's a part of the APIC GUI. You would just do a / Visori, and then it'll bring up its landing page, and you'll have to log in. But it's sort of like a Google search engine for those paths. So any of those manage objects, you can, put in, like in this example here, it's probably hard to see because it's so small, but it's just looking at it from FV tenant. It'll start with all the tenants. And then if you click to the right, it will expand everything underneath at that level. And if you click to the left, it will go ahead and compress those back. And then you'll be at like the level of whatever that particular object was. And you can search for things, and you can also save the configurations from this too. You can download the configs, and then you'll have that exact payload for that managed object. Or if you want to see like the URL, you can have that provided to you as well. So after you run the query, it'll show you like the URL for whatever that object was. Another way of doing that is more dynamically, and that's what the API inspector does. So as you're configuring in the GUI, it's just like like a REST API sniffer. It's going to collect for you all of those REST API calls, and you can filter them and also save them so that you have the specific paths that were used from the GUI, because it's the same thing. It's the same REST API under the hood. So you can use those to build your configurations as well. And then what we're doing is we're kind of avoiding all this because we're just pulling in the configs through the modules, right? So we're querying these configs, and they're already packaged in the format that they need to be. So we don't have to build them from scratch. This would be more like you want to build your configs from the ground up. We're just taking them and pulling them in, and then we can wrap our head around the intent of what we want to declare from a configuration, but we don't have to figure out that data structure. It's already there and packaged for us and good to go. So these are just links to the collections themselves. There's a lot of them, or modules in these collections. There's two different ones. There's the MSO ones, are actually, I think they may have been renamed by now, but it's the NDO, the Nexus Dashboard Orchestrator. So there's collections for those, all those modules, and collections for anything that's Fabric. So if you're doing a Fabric specific configuration, you would want to go to the Cisco.ACI collections. And this is just an example of what they look like. So this is the tenant that we've been talking about, where at the parent level of the configuration, really the only thing that you're configuring is the tenant name. So that's what tenant is here, and a description, right? And the description is optional. The state is important in Ansible, regardless the type of module it is, it works the same way. Because Ansible is idempotent, what we can do is we can see with present, which is the same as merged with some of the other networking modules. It'll look to see if that config is there, if it's present. And if it is, it leaves it alone and it'll move to the next task. If the configuration's not there, then it knows that it needs to make that change, and it'll merge that change. It'll add that change, into the configuration of the ACI fabric, and then it'll move to the next task. If you want to remove a configuration, it's the opposite. It's state of absent. So if it doesn't see it in there, it ignores it and moves to the next task. But if it does see it and the state is absent, it will delete that specific configuration. And then the third one, the one that we're using is kind of the secret sauce here, is the query. So the query is how we can glean that structured configuration and pull that data in from ACI. And instead of evaluating it as JSON or XML, another thing that we can do that's very easy in Ansible is we can convert it to YAML. And then it's more human readable and it's easier to look at, especially with nested configurations or nested dictionaries and list elements and those types of things that are kind of hard to look at in the other formats. We can convert it to that and then save those files. And then we have files that we can use as a single source of truth, like if we want to do diff checks and and also check to see what the available state is of the configs before we make a change. Here's the ACI REST module that I mentioned that we mainly do this primarily, not so much for configurations, where this example is alluding to that because it's a post. It's usually a get, because at this point, there's no need to do a lot of posts anymore because we have a very good, in terms of the scope of what we cover with the modules for configuring, there really shouldn't be any gaps. So in the earlier days, there were more gaps. So you might have found yourself or arrived at a point where you needed to use the REST API module to configure something. But these days, it's mainly for gets. And when you leverage the get, you would also want to look into those query parameters to just optimize what's coming back. But you can do that here in YAML format. So you can see here as you look at the content, right? It's going to the tenant, just like we showed earlier: tenant, attribute, name, and then description. The two things that you can configure. And then this is just the exact same thing, but we can use JSON, right? So we just have the curly braces, and it's just a different way of expressing that same data or that same configuration. And it's really just your preference. This last thing here is just a call out, with building ACI as code. It's important to understand like your journey, like where you are and where you're going. In this particular demo, I'm not like leveraging the Git repo for a push trigger. That's mainly like when I want to check my configuration in like a staging environment every time that I make a change. In my particular demo, we are using the repo, but I am initiating it from a self-service survey and a workflow. So it's just a different way of triggering the playbooks. Like at the end of the day, we're managing playbooks in the Ansible Automation Controller, but I could do that from like GitLab or GitHub. So I make a change there, and then I create a push trigger, which is really just a webhook. And then the webhook would tell the Ansible automation platform to either trigger running a workflow or running a job template that runs a specific playbook. We're effectively doing the same thing. I have a different lab that or demo that focuses on this in particular, but I wanted to show you the brownfield where we're reading in the configs and then modifying them. So it's built a little bit different. But at the end of the day, the best practice for really any of these is you should be able to create like a digital twin of your production environment by exporting out a config, take a snapshot, of that current configuration of ACI, export it into your staging environment, which hopefully is like an actual lab that represents hardware of a fabric. But if not, at a minimum, it's like an ACI simulator, right? So you have like the configuration state of what you want to test before you make a change in production, and make those changes using your automation into staging, and then do all your pre and post checks. And from that, you validate a good configuration that you can then merge from like a staging branch in your repository into like a main branch. An approval process, if you're including like an Ansible workflow or just change control system that is also in line here that gives you the thumbs up to push that configuration into production. So that's kind of the gist here. Our demo is just a little bit different.